Exodus, we're looking at the dramatic deliverance of Israel from Egypt. A great part of the biblical story where God puts his glory on display. And we've worked through how God has proven to be the one true God as he defeats the greatest superpower on the planet at the time, Pharaoh, by throwing Pharaoh, his horses, and his chariots into the sea. After delivering Israel and showing them mercy and revealing himself to them, God takes them into the wilderness for a time of testing. And this is going to be important, wilderness, because this is one of those themes that actually we're going to see throughout the scripture. God taking Israel into the wilderness for a time of testing. And God is doing this because he's taking his people somewhere. We might get so caught up in the dramatic deliverance of Israel that we might stop there. But the goal of rescuing Israel from Egypt is to take them to the promised land. God has a goal, and the goal of Exodus is God building a new Eden where he can dwell with his people and enable them to fill the earth with men and women who represent and glorify him. In a sense, the goal of Exodus is to rescue people from the effects of the curse and bring them through the wilderness into a new Garden of Eden where they can worship and represent him. But before God brings them into this garden, he needs to prepare them, to train them. And one way he is going to prepare them is by giving them his law and by giving them a tabernacle. But before he even makes this great Mosaic covenant with them, he wants to test them and prepare them. And he does that here in the wilderness on the way to Mount Sinai in order to teach them the importance of depending on his word. Because Israel is coming out of Egypt and they are bad. I mean, these people are more Egyptian than they are godly. And part of God's purpose with Israel is to use them to glorify himself through being a unique nation, a different nation. And so he brings them into the wilderness partly so that he can help them by training them and changing them. And we'll see specifically in the wilderness, they face 4 major obstacles or trials, and God delivers them from each one in a miraculous way, proving he is able to sustain them. First of all, there's a shortage of water at Marah in Exodus 15. Then there's a lack of food in the wilderness in Exodus 16. Then there's a lack of water again at Rephidim in Exodus 17. And then there's a great enemy, the Amalekites, in the latter part of Exodus 17. And in each of these stories, there's a pattern. There's a journey, there is a test, there is grumbling, there is intercession by Moses on their behalf, and then there is deliverance. After the law that is given at Sinai, we'll see there are a couple more stories like these, but with 2 added elements before the intercession. There's going to be judgment and repentance, and then the mediation of Moses and deliverance. But right now, this is a training time for Israel. They were supposed to learn from this, and we're actually supposed to learn from this as well. Paul points us back to this experience in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and he says, 1, it happened for us. 2, it was written down for us. 3, it's full of Christ. And 4, in these wilderness experiences, God is teaching us how not to act. And in each of these tests and trials, God also reveals something about himself, something about what he expects of Israel, and something about what he's planning to do with Israel. In Exodus 15, verse 26, we see that they needed to obey, and if they would obey, God promises they would be protected from the diseases that the Egyptians experienced. In Exodus 16, 28, and 29, we're going to see the importance of remembering the Sabbath, remembering rest, to rest. And why was rest so important, by the way? Well, Israel was pointing back to the Garden of Eden. They were pointing back to the world as how it should be. And certainly one of God's great goals in creating this world was that shalom, that rest, that relaxation, that enjoyment. And so if they were going to be a picture to the world of how God intended the world to function, they needed a day of rest. And then Exodus 17, verse 6, in the third test, they're going to learn that the Lord is their provider. And in the fourth text, Exodus 17, 14 through 16, that the Lord will fight for them. He is their warrior. Now, we'll just think about two of the tests real quickly and specifically. First, almost immediately after God rescued them and he provides sweet water for them and brings them to a place where there is much water, the people start complaining and actually saying that they wished they would have stayed and died in Egypt. This is Exodus 16, verse 3. And God uses this opportunity to prove he can provide for the people and also to test them. He can give them the food that they need. He literally ends up raining down bread on the people, giving them only one rule, that they would gather the day's portion. He does this first, he says, in order to test them, whether or not they would walk in his law or not. And secondly, he does this that they would know that he is the Lord their God. Moses then gives people specific instructions to gather as much as they can eat, but not to leave any over until the morning. But, Exodus says, they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. On the day before the Sabbath, they were told to gather enough for the Sabbath. Some people did that, and the bread lasted for them. Others still went out and tried to gather on the Sabbath, but they found none. And this prompts God to say to Moses, Exodus 16:28, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? Obviously, he's teaching them what through this whole process in the wilderness? He wants them to be a people who depend on him daily and to obey his word completely. They prove their faith in God by obeying God. Will you do what God says, even if you don't think it's best? And that's not just a question for Israel, that's a question for us. And yet, after providing bread for them in this miraculous way, the people come to the point where they lack water. Again, in the beginning of chapter 17. And again, instead of going to God and depending on him, like he just taught them, they complain and ask God why he brought them out of Egypt. So in essence, they're putting God on trial. In Exodus 17:2, Moses says, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Specifically, in verse 7, we see that they're testing the Lord by asking, is the Lord among us or not? Now, I want you to watch this, because God's allowed to test people. Testing in and of itself is not a terrible thing, because what is testing? Testing is a way of seeing whether someone's able to do what they say they can do. But listen, testing always goes from the person in a position of higher authority to a person in a position of lesser authority. So teachers can test their students. Employers can test their employees. It doesn't get to go the other way around. And when we do flip that order, and when the person in lesser authority tests the person in higher authority, it is an act of mistrust. It is an act of rebellion. It is our job to trust God, not to test God. What's the difference? Trusting God is taking God at his word and obeying God. And testing God is acting like you're more important than God and trying to command God and acting like you have the right to grumble if he doesn't do what you think he should. Now, God is gracious to Israel here. Even though they're grumbling and testing him, he provides for them. And how do they get the water they need? Exodus 17:6, they strike the rock. And who does Psalm 78:35 say the rock was? They remembered that God was their rock. And then who does Paul say this rock represented? 1 Corinthians 10:4, he says the rock was Christ. Another reminder that Christ is God. But the Israelites were sinning a great sin, and yet God is here to show them mercy, and he does so through, in a sense, being struck in their place. Think about it. One man writes, if we have here a picture of Yahweh standing before the rock, Moses striking the rock, and Yahweh being identified with the rock, with the result that water flows out so that the people might drink, then it would seem that Yahweh is being struck so that the people might drink. Through the striking of their Lord, the people received the water of life. Such an interpretation might inform those places in the Gospel of John where Jesus indicates that he will provide living water for his people, and then when he is struck, blood and water flow from his side. In these two tests in the wilderness, we see the importance of faith and depending on God, and the danger of testing God. And while Israel failed in the wilderness here, both of these tests, these same tests are going to come up later, where God's Messiah goes into the wilderness. And the question we're going to be asking as we look at God's Messiah in the wilderness is whether or not he will depend on God and whether or not he will test God. Of course, we know we can rejoice because our Messiah conquered and won and succeeded where Israel failed. So God's delivered Israel, and he's taking them into the wilderness, and he's doing it all for a purpose. That's the point. And in Exodus 19 through 24, we begin to discover that purpose as God enters into a covenantal relationship with them. And this begins the section of Exodus that we actually start reading through much more quickly. It's a hard section for us, but it's really the heart and soul of the book, Exodus 19 through 24. And I'm going to attach a video to this one, and I'd encourage you to watch it so you can get a sense of how all this flows, because these chapters are important chapters, and in these chapters, it's as if the story that Moses has been telling is put on pause. From now on, it's going to be mostly passages about law and how to worship with a few stories in between until the book of Numbers. But while the story might seem to slow down, there are a number of things that highlight its importance. One, we see God speaks directly in Exodus 20, which is huge. And actually, if you look back, you'll notice the whole book of Exodus so far has been waiting for this moment, in that in Exodus 3:12, God declared to Moses at the burning bush, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." Exodus 3 is like, wait for it, wait for it. Here we are, Exodus 19, it's coming. And so whether these chapters are easy for us or not, the reality is we have to pay attention to them if we're going to understand the Pentateuch. Overall, these chapters speak to two general topics. First of all, the Mosaic covenant in 19:1 through 24:11, and they define and explain the purpose of Israel's relationship with Yahweh and the boundaries, what God expects from them. So far, we've seen the Noahic covenant, you remember, and the Abrahamic covenant, and now we've moved forward to the Mosaic covenant, which is a very important step forward in our understanding of God's salvation plan. And then secondly, the second major topic in the rest of Exodus, this moves past chapter 24 to 25 through 40, is the tabernacle. And the tabernacle provides a context where Israel would relate to God. And really, it's God living with Israel. It's huge. It gives focus to their object of worship and helps to distinguish them from all other peoples. Now, remember, this is part of a story. God's delivered his people. He's tested his people. And now, in 19 through 24, before he comes to dwell with his people, he enters into a covenant with them. We call this the Mosaic covenant. You can see it called that in 2 Corinthians 3, 14 and 15, Exodus 24:7, Exodus 34:27. You can look them up. And this is going to be for a purpose. God wants to bless the descendants of Abraham and through them the world. His plan is to restore the creation through Israel. After delivering them from Egypt and before they enter into the land, God enters into an agreement with them. And the purpose of this agreement is to enable them to enjoy the blessings that he wants to give them and to be a blessing for others. So you might call this an administrative kind of covenant. The Abrahamic covenant, bless the world. That's the goal. The Mosaic covenant explains how it was going to happen. God has this purpose for Israel, and this covenant teaches them how to fulfill that purpose and provides consequences if they don't. One scholar explains, this covenant will show them how to be his true humanity. It will direct, guide, and lead them to have a right relationship with everyone else in the covenant community. It will also teach them how to have a right relationship to all creation, to be good stewards of the earth's resources. We might say then that the Mosaic covenant is given at this time, now catch this, to administer the fulfillment of the divine promises to Abraham and to the nation as a whole, and through them to the entire world. And this is important context, because understanding the law and how it can apply to us is a little difficult. Like, one thing that's going to happen in Exodus and then especially Leviticus is that there is a lot of law here. And you have to ask, why is all this law here? Because are we supposed to do all this? Were they supposed to do this in order to be saved? We have a lot of questions. And if we go back to the meaning of the word law, we know it's guidance, it's teaching. And because of that, we might think the primary purpose of this is for us to read it and to do what it says, almost as if this is how we earn God's favor. But it's not quite that simple, because obviously this teaching, this law, instruction that we're reading comes within the framework of a story about how man's broken this world and how God is stepping in to restore it, and how he's doing it through entering into a specific covenant with a particular group of people, Israel. So before we get to the 10 Commandments and all of these laws, as one man has put it, we get the story of creation, the brokenness of our sin and rebellion, and the wonder of God's redemption displayed in the Exodus of the Israelites. This means the law was given to a people who not only knew that story and knew the God who stands behind it, but who had lived it as well. God gave his law to people who had already experienced his grace, his love, and his faithfulness, his great act of salvation, and who had even learned from their forefather Abraham how they were to be counted righteous. Even if you look at the beginning of the book of the 10 Commandments, how do the 10 Commandments begin? Usually we begin the 10 Commandments with, you shall have no other gods before me, but it actually begins before that, doesn't it? It begins, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So before the law comes a reminder of God's grace, which reminds us that obeying the law was never a way to earn God's salvation, but the right way for redeemed people to respond to God's salvation when they had experienced it. And God gave Israel his law in order to shape them into a society that would reflect his character and his values in the midst of the nations. You remember the purpose of Israel. Again, it's kind of like God is putting Israel back in the Garden of Eden, but now the world is all messed up. And so there have to be all these laws, but they are to live in such a way to show the people the glory of God. As one man puts it, the law was not a set of arbitrary rules to keep God happy. It was a way of life, a way of being human, a culture in a particular time and place to show what a redeemed people under God looks like. And that's important. There's a great book where the author talks about the purpose of these laws in the Pentateuch, and he says, why are they here? Why are they reading them? He gives 4 reasons. 1, they're here for Israel. It was to help them live lives that were good for each other. You remember how Jesus summarized the law, love God and your neighbor. The law taught them how to do that. I once heard someone describe the 10 Commandments as Israel's Bill of Rights. But what usually happens in a Bill of Rights? A Bill of Rights is usually about your rights. But the 10 Commandments are teaching you about other people's rights. First of all, they're teaching you God's rights, and then they're teaching you your neighbor's rights, because that's how God wants Israel to learn to think, looking out for the good of others. And as they do that, this will help them fulfill their purpose, which was bigger than themselves. Second, to help Israel showcase God's glory to the nation. The law is there to teach Israel how to love God and their neighbor. And second, it's there to teach Israel how to showcase God's glory to the nations. Third, though, to demonstrate man's inability to keep God's covenant and their need for the Spirit. And this is big. The law is a teacher. And one of the things the law was going to do was demonstrate the problem of sin and to show that it ran so deep that even with all these resources and even with all these blessings and even with all these privileges, without the Spirit of God at work, Israel wasn't going to be able to keep their end of the covenant, which gets us ready for Christ. And that's the 4th purpose of the law, to point forward to God's great messianic plan, which means if we read the law as just kind of like, let's all go and do this, we're kind of missing the point, because the whole story shows that we can't do this and we need a Messiah who can keep God's law for us. One place we begin getting a glimpse of this is in Exodus 19, 4 through 6, which is kind of the introduction to the covenant. God's delivered Israel. He's trained Israel. He's about to give them all these laws, and now he tells them why. He says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So what's happening is that before he makes the covenant, explains the purpose. And the purpose of the covenant, I'm quoting here now, is that an obedient Israel may bring God's creation blessing to the world. If Israel obeys the divine commandments, it will become God's treasured possession among the peoples, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A treasured possession suggests a personal article of movable property with an immense value. It can be compared to a father's concern for a son. This distinguishes Israel from all the nations that also belong to the Lord. A holy nation means a nation set apart by its holiness or its service to God. If Israel becomes a holy nation, it will image God to the nations. And the final phrase designates Israel as a particular type of kingdom. Instead of being a kingdom of a particular king, it will be a kingdom marked by a priesthood. That is, service of God on behalf of people and vice versa. It will be a kingdom run not by politicians relying on strength and connivance, but by priests depending on faith in Yahweh, a servant nation instead of a ruling nation. Israel will thus redefine the meaning of dominion, service. This will be its distinctive task, its distinguishing characteristic among the world of nations. It will reclaim the lost dominion of humanity. To say it another way, as one man has, as a priest represents the people before God and then represents God to the people, Israel is called to do the same. Israel's called to be a community of priests whose congregation is nothing less than the whole globe. The end of the covenant is not Israel's own salvation, but the inclusion of the nations, since all the earth belongs to God. The expression holy nations underscores the twofold character of Israel. It is set apart to God, and it is visible as such to the rest of the world. It is a holy life lived in community that will display God's name to the world. Israel will essentially be a shop window of God to the world. This will be the purpose of the laws at the end of the day, to help Israel know as a nation how they are to image God and make God known to the world. Though God is invisible, he will be made visible through the actions of a people that are close to him. That is why God chose Israel. Now we have to ask, how are they going to do that? And what do they need if they're going to do that? And maybe let's watch another video. I'm going to attach two videos to this one. One on the screen there, and then one in the comments section. But these videos will help you understand and review what we're saying by all this, and you need to, because Exodus is just such a pivotal book for understanding the Bible and the story of what God's doing through Jesus.